Hi guys, we're going to start our last chapter of the year, which is the Age of Jackson, and that's generally the age historians consider from 1824 about to 1848. So this will take us up just before the Mexican-American War, which is really our start for next year. So we're going to go through the presidency of Jackson as well as his successors, and we're going to talk about the building sectionalism that's going on in the United States. And really, after the Missouri Compromise, like we talked about, we've both legally and almost emotionally divided the country into sections. And you can see them here. It's not just North and South. The West is also part of this. And we're going to see the beginnings of the causes of the Civil War here. If we look at each one individually, the North, much more of an industrial area. We have all sorts of new inventions, the cotton gin. We have Slater's Mill right here in Rhode Island. In Lowell, the factory system is created, which is allowed this capitalist class, if you will, to emerge in the North. We have long-standing stories about the mistreatment of women and children in these factories. And really, from a political perspective, they're led by two guys from Massachusetts, John Quincy Adams, who will be the future president, and Daniel Webster is the prominent lawyer. If we look at the South, really, the South hasn't emerged economically or industrialized in any capacity. King cotton is now the cash crop of the South. Really replaced tobacco, has a lot more value on the international stage. There's very little industry present. As we get to the Civil War, we'll see that's a big problem for the South, and it's really dominated by a rich ruling planting class that have large plantations, large numbers of slaves, and they exert an incredible amount of political as well as economic influence. The West is really this emerging land based on farming, but much smaller family farms. Land, as we're going to see, is incredibly cheap. And the American government encourages people to move west and buy land. It's a great way for them to raise revenue. And we're going to start to see a real increase in democracy in this area, particularly in the election of 1828. Now, if you look on this map, we have the lines divided, and those are really more just based on boundaries, but we start to see a real division emerge in 1824 with Henry Clay's American system. And this was one of your vocab words. It's his economic system that was going to get him elected for president in 1824. He was convinced this appealed to all Americans. And when he proposed this, he just assumed he was going to win the presidency. We're going to see that obviously won't happen. But the idea is it's going to stimulate manufacturing in the North, increase the demand for cotton in the South and West, and everyone will be totally happy. And there are three parts to this plan. The tariffs. Tariffs are really important in the North, and we're really going to look at this sectionally. A tariff is a very high tax on foreign goods with the idea of promoting business within your own country. The North loved this, obviously, because of Slater's Mill, because of the Lowell factory system, and they want Americans buying American goods. But we're going to see that the sections emerge here. The South hates the tariff because they're fearful that their cotton won't be purchased by Europe or that the taxes will be very high in it. The West, for the most part, did favor tariffs because as the North grows industrially, more people will move there. It means they have a higher demand for their food that can't be grown in the South. So immediately we start to see a split there. The next one is the Bank of the United States. And this has been debated by the founding fathers ever since Hamilton and Jefferson began their first arguments. Northern businessmen loved the idea of the bank. It created a stable currency that could be used for trade. The South and the West hated the bank. And we're going to see that this is the enemy of Andrew Jackson because they feared that this was too much federal power. And it was easier for state banks to loan money as opposed to having to go through the federal government. The last one is the internal improvements. And this was really Clay's bone that he threw to the West. The idea that we're going to create infrastructure projects in the West, things like the Erie Canal, one of your vocab words. North loves this because this creates an expansion of their goods. The South opposes it because they weren't really going to benefit from any of these goods because of their lack of industry. And the West, like I said, loved it because the government is paying for their internal improvements, different types of infrastructure projects, bridges, canals, roadways that will allow them to access the North. So we can immediately see the division emerge here as part of Henry Clay's system. And certainly you can see in this political cartoon to the right, you have the North that loves this. Most of it, anyway, loves this. and the South who absolutely despises it. So whether he realized it or not, he was creating division. And we see this division emerge in his election in 1824. James Monroe steps down after his 2 terms in the era of good feelings. And what we get is probably the most sectional election until 1860, which was Lincoln. 5 different people are nominated for the presidency, representing the different sections of the country, as well as the different socioeconomic groups. We have John C. Calhoun, who we've already met, who was really represented the rich planters of the South. William Crawford, a name you just won't need to remember, I'll be honest. He represented the small, poor farmers of the South. John Quincy Adams, who was going to represent the newly formed National Republicans, or what we'll know as the Whigs. He represents the Northeast. You have Henry Clay, who represents the West. And then Andrew Jackson, who's really he's called the darling of New Democracy. As states start to emerge like Tennessee and Kentucky, they want more participation in the federal government, and Jackson is going to be their hero. After votes are tallied, Jackson is the clear winner. He has 99 electoral votes, but does not have enough for a majority. So as we know, according to the 12th Amendment, the top 3 finishers, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford, so not Clay, who was eliminated, and not Calhoun, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford go to the House of Representatives. Each state gets 1 vote. Now, Clay is the Speaker of the House. That means he controls, really, influence over the House. So Clay, who absolutely hated Andrew Jackson, wasn't a big fan of John Adams, but liked him a hell of a lot more than Jackson, says, hey, I'm going to make a deal with you. And he meets with him twice between January 1st and January 9th and says, look, if you give me Secretary of State, I will swing the election in your favor. And the reason why he wanted Secretary of State was, to that point, except for John Adams, every president before that, after Washington, had been Secretary of State before they became president. So it was seen as that really stepping stone to the presidency. And you can see in this little cartoon here, it does a pretty good job explaining how it works. Jackson's allies are absolutely incensed. They call Clay the Judas of the West because he betrayed their Western values to allow a Northerner like John Quincy Adams to become president. And they won't forget it. Believe me, they'll come back with a vengeance in 1828. But for now, at least for 1 term, John Quincy Adams is president. Really nothing happens during his presidency that we need to talk about. So we're really going to jump ahead to 1828. And Jackson, thanks to a huge increase in Democratic suffrage, meaning we've lowered the property values for people to vote, Jackson trounces Adams, 178 to 83. And even his own supporters blamed the death of his wife on John Quincy Adams' negative attacks. And they portrayed him as this basically idiotic president who was spending money left and right. You can see there, he built a billiards table. He wanted a national college or university because that's how the northern elites were portrayed. Jackson's by far the most dominant and position-altering president until Abraham Lincoln. And really, until him, there is no one even remotely close to him. We're going to talk a little bit about his beliefs. He believed in the stewardship theory, which is the idea that he is the servant of the people. He is not there for his own political gain. He represents the farmer, the laborer, and the mechanic, as he said. And he would act in their best interest. And we're going to see in our next video, that's how he justifies some of his political actions. And he also believed in the spoil system. He hated the idea of the northern elite always being in office and the same people all the time. So what he did was he employed what's called the rotation in office. He wouldn't let people stay in office for too long. He would constantly replace them. Many of them were his loyal Democrats. That's the new party they've created. And many of them, for some reason, were put in the post office, which always seems to happen. We'll talk about that when we get to Rhode Island. And he created what's called the kitchen cabinet, this informal group of advisors that weren't the normal Washington elite, not your normal Northerners that were always controlling things. And he believed very much in small government. He vetoed more bills than the first 6 presidents combined. And he didn't do it based on his personal views. He did it on constitutionality. Can we do this? And we're going to see this come up in our next video. And he also was one of the first presidents to utilize the pocket veto, which we've talked about. And his presidency ushers in this new democracy. It ends the Virginia dynasty, which we talked about. And he wasn't one of those, the chip off old Plymouth Rock, as the Adams were called. He was really not overly intelligent, didn't receive formal education. but ironically received an honorary degree from Harvard College, which was John Quincy Adams' alma mater, and he was absolutely appalled by it. And you can see the quote there. He said he couldn't watch my darling Harvard award a degree to a barbarian who could scarcely spell his own name. So a little bit of historical irony there. But Jackson was really a man of the people. He really reached out to them. People felt that he was representing their values. The day of his inauguration, people just got drunk on the White House lawn, and there was a huge mob that followed him into the White House. And really, all of these new people are voting because we have democratic reforms in the Midwest. More people can vote, less restrictions. Rhode Island was actually one of the last ones to do this. And we'll talk about that particularly next year, why they were so opposed to allowing immigrants and the poor to vote. And the last thing we're going to take a look at this political cartoon. Jackson absolutely was hated by his political opponents. The Whig Party was created in opposition to him. And you can see this political cartoon here. They dubbed him King Andrew I. They felt that he was overutilizing the power of the veto, preventing Congress from doing its job. But in our next video, we're going to see that he really did this because this is what he believed the Constitution said he had to do, including killing the bank, which was really he viewed as his mortal enemy.